Nothing else.
Okay. Just think of, yeah, it should just roll everywhere. Yes.
Are you going to do some manual intervention as well? Or are we just going to think about it?
I'm just going to let them roll through. They're mostly kind of these diagrams, and then there's that selection that Talia kind of sent through, and then yeah, there's this really nice little animation.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, how great is this?
The first one's just like doing this, like, the archives,
Yeah. I know. So interesting.
I was reading off my phone. I feel like I should get a system with that.
Yeah. Hold on. Escape. That's gonna have a heart attack. Yeah, then I'm not sure if you have a look at these. The Zoom.
I think it's my sketch.
It just kind of rolls through every. Yeah. So it shouldn't be too intense changing. Yeah. Well, we might give it a couple of minutes. I think some people will probably go to the gallery first and then have to come find me over here. Yeah.
Well, I was that only people can into and then so
Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name's Catherine and I work in curatorial and public engagement at UNSW Galleries. And this evening we're meeting here on Bidjigal and Gadigal land. For millennia, this has been a place of art making, teaching, learning, and continues to be. We acknowledge the two language groups at the Art Design campus because we're situated on a boundary line. So we also reflect on that this has been a place for sharing, for meeting and exchanging knowledge, and strive to continue that in a lot of our programming. I'm really delighted tonight to welcome José Roca, Talia Linz and James Gatt, who will be having a discussion that attempts to tackle the quite broad question, what is curating and how should we do it? José Roca is a Colombian curator and recently the artistic director of the 23rd Biennale of Sydney, Rivus, which has just finished this past weekend. He runs Flora, Arts and Natura, an independent space for contemporary art in Bogota, Colombia. And from 2012 to 15, he was the Estrelita B. Brodsky adjunct curator of Latin American art at Tate London. For a decade, he's also managed the arts program at the Banco de la República in Bogota. Jose is joined by Talia Linz, who is curator at Art Space, where she works with artists across generations on major exhibitions, new commissions, multi-platform projects, public programs, and publications. She was previously the Nick Waterlow OAM Curatorial Fellow at the Biennale of Sydney, Executive Producer of Arts and Culture at FBI Radio, and Assistant Editor at Art and Australia. Talia was also a member of the Curatorium for the 23rd Biennale of Sydney. And moderating the conversation this evening is James Gatt, who's an independent curator and writer based on Gadigal land. James recently curated Elizabeth Pulley's first career survey at UNSW Galleries earlier this year, and from 2015 to 2017 was founding director of Squiggle Space, a hybrid studio and project space dedicated to open-ended inquiry and critical discussion. James is currently Associate Director at Sarah Cottier Gallery and founding editor of Café Larde, a local journal for dialogical texts. I might hand over to James now, if you can all join me in welcoming. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Welcome, everybody. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the unceded land of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people. And it's really my honor to welcome Talia and Jose here to speak to us tonight about curating. This conversation the impetus for the conversation was very selfish. I really wanted to ask them these questions, and I thought maybe it would be interesting to welcome other people into this conversation because I'm often asking myself what curating is. I think if you talk to any curator, they'll all give you a very different definition of it. We just had a very kind of confusing conversation about it in the hall before we came in. So I kind of want to get to at least use the methodology that they applied to Rivus, the Sydney Biennale, to unpack some of the questions that I've had around curating. Jose and Talia are just two of the 5 members of the Curatorium that was assembled for Rivus, the Sydney Biennale. They were joined throughout the project by Pascal Dantos-Berry, Anna Davis, and Hannah Donnelly. So hopefully all of you have been to see the Sydney Biennale. Jose and Talia, congratulations on a really rigorous and thought-provoking exhibition. We were just discussing it included 89 practitioners, not all of whom were artists, some designers, some rivers, and some objects. The way that we're going to structure today is we'll probably talk for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions, about 20 minutes worth of questions. If you're going to ask a question, can you please make sure it's a question? I know that sounds silly, but often when I do these, people attack the panel instead. And try to ask questions. So I'll start with you, Jose. Jose, why was it important for you to assemble a curatorium?
Yeah, thank you for being here. So when I was invited to submit a proposal, the very first idea was to put together a team, because I like to work collaboratively with other curators that I already knew. Maybe someone that was an expert in the Australian scene, which I didn't know at all. and someone from that knew Southeast Asia. So I entertained that idea for a while, but then it sort of dawned on me that it would be better to work with a larger group of people that were to be local and should be associated with the institutions that regularly collaborate with the Biennale. Because what has happened so far is that a curator is brought from outside, from abroad often, and then they curate a show that then gets cut into pieces and divided across the different exhibition partners like the MCA or the art gallery or art space, with no or little participation of those institutions in the content. I imagine there must be some negotiation between art space or the art gallery and the curators as to what gets shown at their premises, but certainly not in the course of the curatorial process. So I thought that was problematic because I thought that the institutions that were to participate in the Biennale should own this project. So that is why when I was pre-selected, it was I think they selected 4 finalists, and they flew us here to defend the project. Then I changed and I said, well, if I am selected, I would like to do it this way, but also because I thought that there should be a different way of doing exhibitions, that a way that is more sustainable, and we all know that the best way to become sustainable is to try to consume local. So in this case was to become local or as local as possible. So I also pitched the idea that I would come to come to Sydney and live for the entire duration of the process. And working with local curators meant that we would minimize our carbon footprint by working as a team. I also proposed that we would consider all of years of combined travel for art as the trips for the Biennale. So we would not travel. And if you're familiar with how Biennales are put together, it's usually a curator crisscrosses the globe and then finds the new artists or the new practices for Biennale. But what is not new for me might be new for the new context. So many artists from Latin America, for example, that for me are well known, are completely new in this context. So I thought it was fair game that we would each work with artists and other practices that we knew well, minimizing the need for travel. And early on, we said that we would only travel once an artist was vetted by the team, and then one of us would travel there to work with them in developing the project. That, of course, couldn't happen because COVID struck and no travel was possible. But that was one of the reasons, or to sum it up, many of the reasons that made me work with a team of curators.
Yeah, one of the criticisms that's often brought to international curators is, of course, that they have no real experience with the place that they're working in. So it's interesting to hear that you did come to live here. But it also strikes me that then you're able to have real-time conversations with the other people that you're working with, and of course you have to be having those conversations with artists as well. Talia, did you've worked on Sydney Biennale at Art Space previous to being on the Curatorium. How was working in a curatorium, as Jose describes it, different from how other curators have worked on the Sydney Biennale?
Yeah, so as Jose said, there is, I suppose in my experience, there's been like some negotiation about who is at each venue, but that is once the artists have already been selected. And, many things factor into that. it depends on, who the curator is, and it's politics, like, speaking frankly, there's a lot of politics involved. But I suppose how it has happened previously in most cases is that the Biennale team with the artistic director get the projects to a certain point, and then there's kind of a literal handover. So it's almost, to a point in time, and then those projects are handed over. Not always. Sometimes, for example, previously at Artspace, some of the artists have been staying in our residential studio, so we have had a much more, close and ongoing development of the project, but more often than not, there is that handover. And so in this kind of setup, when, there was a curator connected to each or most institutions, or most venue partners, from the beginning, there was skin in the game, I suppose. Yeah, so there's investment, a lot more kind of investment, which worked on for both sides. Yeah.
Jose, one of the more interesting things that I heard you say about curating while you were giving your many talks to people about the exhibition was that when you're curating collaboratively within a curatorium, you run the risk of blunting the vision or radicality of it, and I think you could say that applies to probably all collaborative activities, and possibly even including politically the leftist agenda, so why do you think that risk is there? Why was it important to take that risk anyway for you?
Yeah, so I do think that consensus kills or tends to kill radicality. So if you have to arrive to a consensus, and there are practices that really inflame for or against someone in the team, it is very unlikely that practice will make the cut. Because if it comes to a standstill and you have to vote, people will probably not vote for that, and that is my experience. So that is very dangerous, because then some things that really are that one of the members of this curatorial group feel strongly about, then ends up being abandoned in favor for something that in a way is everybody accepts. By the same token, you have to reach some kind of agreement, because I don't like that kind of situation where you're asked, oh, how come you included that? And say, well, I didn't like it, but they outvoted me. I wanted for all of us to really, let's say, stand behind the choices that the group made. So there is always oscillating between those two extremes. I've said this joke before, but it is very graphic. Like the definition of a camel is a horse designed by a committee. So everybody pitches in and puts something, and then this Frankenstein comes together, because it's just the sum of very disparate parts, but not really something that is done in a more intimate way. So all those are the perils. I think we each pitched many practices to the rest, trying to convince them that it was interesting. Since we were continuing existing conversations, we had a lot to say about most of the practices that we brought to the table. So there were really things that we felt strongly about. And then, but I made 2 points. One is that I was never going to have the last word. And then the other thing is that whenever somebody really deeply felt about something, then we would let that practice pass, even if we didn't like it that much, to allow this sort of degree of these radical things to enter through somebody's choices. So that's how we put it together.
I'm interested, as an extension of that, and maybe Talia, you could give us, if you're willing to give some examples. Were there any situations where you know, there was someone who felt strongly that someone shouldn't be in the exhibition or something shouldn't be in the exhibition. And I'm really interested to know what the qualifications were that you brought to that conversation. It can be very difficult when you're talking about art to say, this shouldn't go in because of this. I think it's much easier to find association and relevance than it is to find a point of negation. So
yeah, I was just going to say in regards to the you know, the point you were saying before about consensus squashing radicality. I also think that not necessarily, I don't know, not necessarily in this case, but sometimes working as a group can reinforce it because you're bolstered and you have the group as a sort of, that momentum and that support. And, there is a lot of collective activism that is, what a group can do, an individual may not necessarily be able to. I'm trying to think of a good example. There were definitely.
There were some that I didn't really like at all.
Yeah.
I thought they were not, at the point of being there. In some cases, I think I was proven right.
Yeah.
Like, for example, things that weren't they weren't really projects, but just ideas. But then one of us soldiered on, even writing a grant for that person. And then, it didn't quite work out because, as we had anticipated, it wasn't really ready yet. But, in the end, it was a satisfactory presence, but it was really very difficult, the process that led us there.
I mean, there weren't any, to my memory, any like screaming matches or like walkout fights, any of that. I think, the makeup of the curatorium, well, a particular kind of energy and dynamic was established early on. And I think it was, very grounded in mutual, respect and wanting to learn from each other. And, for me, I like, these peers are kind of amazing colleagues that I've never had the chance to work with in this particular way. I'd worked with Hannah as an artist, and obviously, like, there had been different sort of configurations, but not on a very sort of horizontal playing field across institutions.
And we were very different because Anna, Talia, and I are more, let's say, more conventional curators, but Pascal comes from education and community works, and Hannah to a certain extent as well, and also she's sort of interested in Aboriginal issues. So those are fields that I don't know much about. I think they brought that to the table in a very strong way, and you can, even if you don't know who proposed what, you could sort of figure out which ones were proposed by those two outliers, in the sense of a curatorium composed by curators. Yeah.
Yeah, and biennales are traditionally and increasingly so multidisciplinary. It's very rarely the case now that there aren't designers, architects, poets, etc., included alongside artists in biennales around the world. So to have this multidisciplinary practice represented in the curatorium seems relevant, in my opinion. I was about to say that you all have individual practices that you're kind of bringing something. And so what does that do? Why that, if you kind of take the people out of it, why this collaboration between practices, this interdisciplinary quality of practice? Why is that so important for Rivus anyway, but also for other exhibitions?
In terms of the participants?
Both, for the curatorium and the participants.
Yeah, we wanted to have an exhibition that was, this might sound like a cliche, but much more than the sum of its parts. So we wanted to encourage, this cross-disciplinary thing. We wanted to hear the voice of the non-human. That is why we invited 8 rivers and other waterways, and we also made the point of including in the list as participants non-living objects, just to shake up a bit this idea of an artist, because I often get asked, how many artists or how, like, artists is still very much part of how we think an exhibition is. I mean, what the content of an exhibition is, even though, as you say, it is no longer the case. It is still, this idea of the artist and the exhibition looms large in people's imagination. So we really wanted to shake it up. And I don't know if what it became apparent, but this presence of the rivers was something that you don't find often in the list of participants in a biennial type event.
And so, on the other hand, what are the risks and dangers of collaborating? Sorry, curating, not collaborating. What are the risks and dangers of curating with a strictly singular vision, strictly independently?
I don't know if I understand the question.
So instead of having a curatorium, instead of collaborating
Yeah.
towards on the development of the exhibition, what are the risks of doing it solo?
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, I think that precisely that you have a precise idea and then you carry it out. And I think when you work collectively, there are all these ramifications that you wouldn't really think of, because you have a way of doing things. So of course, I've curated large events by myself, but I found this more enriching for me as a curator, because I'm learning about many other things. And I think that was the case for my colleagues. I made it a point of bringing the art from Latin America to the mix. And since Australia hasn't had really large migrations of Latin Americans, there is no constituency. So there is no mandate for public institutions or private here to show the art from Latin America, because there is no pressure from any constituency. So it gets neglected, and very few artists from the region have been shown at the Sydney Biennale in its 50-year history. So I thought it was a good thing, and now for them, that they might not have been so familiar with it, it's opened up like an entire area. At least it provides a point of entry, and same for me with Australian art that I didn't know much about.
Yeah, I guess reflecting on that, I suppose my default position, and maybe that's, as we were talking before, that I have a background in theatre and performance making. My default is more collaborative than individualistic, which is maybe unusual, although becoming less so. I guess and art space is like often a collaborative model building exhibition. So there's a kind of institutional ethos around that. But I guess with sort of singularly visioned curators, if you could say that, I suppose one of the dangers is just that sort of echo chamber and curating to taste, which is a natural inclination, because of course you want to sort of work with what you are personally interested in and invested in. But if you are working on behalf of an institution, then that's not always appropriate or relevant, and I guess you can become like the person who does like those type of exhibitions, or yeah. But I guess the thing I love about collaboration is that it just kind of extends opportunities for learning and for being challenged and for sort of the unexpected, or in my experience anyway, the unexpected to kind of come into things. And it's sort of like an exponential building of networks and knowledge.
Yeah,
I mean, unless you're like personalities who don't get along, which is
In a very practical way. The first thing I did was to send them the proposal that had won the competition for me, so they knew what I had pitched to the selection committee. And then I did like a day-long, literally day-long presentation of my recent curatorial project. So they knew where I came from because we didn't know each other at all. So then they knew more or less the type of exhibitions that I had done before. And then for our first meetings, everybody took that original idea and fleshed it out. So there are some slides that you will see that are actually from our very first meetings with lots of words and keywords and topics that in each one of us sort of a understanding were related to the main topic. So we then made clusters, and we just saw one that is like a bigger one with lots of possible themes that came from these keywords that we all came together as a group, and then we tried to flesh them out with different practices that we would sort of cluster together. And it became apparent in many cases that there were themes that didn't make the cut. There wasn't enough flesh there. And I like to curate from the art back and not trying to put like a lens or a frame on the art and then curate, that way. So that means that in many cases there were themes that we thought were going to be really strong. Well, the art was contradicting that idea, so we had to, that idea. Well, those are the loose threads, but yeah, the idea of impeding the flows ended up being there somewhere, but somewhere completely abandoned. And the original proposal was about weaving, rivers as ecosystems and weaving as a way to bring on material culture. So non-artist practitioners of literally weaving and then permutations of that. That part got in a way abandoned, so it was to be like a huge component of the Biennale, this weaving part. And some remnants are here and there. They were taken from that part there. Well, it's not in this one. And then just blown apart and attached to other themes because the weaving theme was abandoned.
It's always struck me that curating is inherently collaborative. To talk about weaving, but just in the hallway, we're talking about the different extents to which curators do collaborate with artists as well as with each other. We're all very familiar when you're putting on an exhibition of this scale that there's also a whole team working with the curators to actually deliver, to actually run the programs and get the builds done, et cetera. But Jose, you gave an interesting example about Cuauhtemoc Medina's relationship with Francis Elise, which was kind of a slight tangent, but you've also worked with Francis in a separate way. Do either of you want to speak a little bit about the different extents to which collaboration becomes integral to relationships, either with each other or with artists?
I'd love to talk about my relationship with Francis Elise, but I don't have one, sadly, so I think this one's me.
Yeah, no. So in some cases, there are curators that take a more intimate role or a more active role in the development of the project. I myself, I see more like an editor, sort of giving feedback to an artist in the development of their work, but I'm not let's say, a prescriptive or prospective curator in the sense of telling someone what they should do. And sometimes and there were some examples in this Biennale, I didn't think that was the right way to develop the project, but still it is them who are exposing themselves. In Spanish, exponer, it's to exhibit, and exponerse is to be exposed. So they share the same word. So if you are exhibiting, you are exposing yourself. You are very vulnerable, and that, you know, you should. It's your responsibility. So it is not me to try to create. Um, I can give feedback, but it is not up to me to create the work. So I stop short always. There are more curators. There are curators or colleagues that are more like sort of they are more let's say, yeah, intimately linked to the development of the project.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that in my experience, and I'm sort of only 10 years in, so I'm a baby curator compared to Jose and to other people in this audience. But I think if you're sort of after a particular type of work or a particular strain of an artist's practice, then it is beneficial for both just to be upfront about that. And if it's if there's the room for kind of ambition and invention and sort of that freedom to create, and I think that's often based in trust. If you've worked with them before, you know each other's practices and how you work, and you trust that something will come out that is kind of value. But yeah, I think you can get into trouble if you sort of as a curator have something in your head and then the artist has something in their head, and those things don't end up being aligned.
Yeah, one of the mistakes that one often makes as a curator is that you invite an artist because you like a certain type of practice. So you want the work that they did for the Istanbul Biennale, where they sort of traced the wall, the rivers that had been paved upon. So you expect them to do that same work with the rivers in Sydney, but they are not interested in doing that kind of work because they've done it before or they've done it already, like us with the grass portraits by Akron and Harvey. I was sort of hoping that they wouldn't say, "We've done that for 20 years. We don't want to see grass anymore," and that would have been that. But it is true that sometimes we make that mistake, of attaching ourselves to a certain type of practice, expecting the artist to do a riff on that for this new project, and they are not interested. And then sometimes something interesting comes out of that, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the artist ends doing like could be termed a transitional piece, and that has happened to me many times in the biennales that I've curated. I invite someone because of the type of work this type of work that I find really compelling and strong. The person doesn't want to do what they've done before and what they are known for because they want to try something new. They do. It is not quite developed. And then you see in maybe another biennale that they achieved this incredible thing of which your piece was the seed of. Well, that's you have to sort of allow those things to happen.
Damn artists. I wanted to ask you as well. So, talking about collaborating with artists and curators, collaboration is also the foundation for socialism, for activism. To me, it certainly seems as though this Biennale has that facet to it. Certainly been described as a call to action in a very basic way by most people that have seen it. Do you think of curating in those ways? Did you think of your exhibition in those ways for both of you? And are there any pre-existing models that you looked at for this Biennale?
Well, this particular configuration, I had I did sort of biennial type event in Philadelphia in 2010 called Philagraphica, and it was similar. I worked with curators, each one associated with the main exhibition venues, and it really worked well. So that in terms of the structure of the curatorial group, coming back to this idea of a more socialist model, both in the sense of a call for action and in the sense of everybody having an equal voice. Um, well, that's there, of course, but it must be said that curating is not an exhibition, a biennial is not a festival. It's not like everybody is welcome. It is not, you know, it is a curating implies taking decisions. Curating, curators are brought because nobody wants to tell the mother which kids have to be left on the islands and which can climb on the raft, to put it very bluntly. We have to make those decisions of what doesn't make the cut, what gets included. So curating is about including, but as it is, as much as including as it is about excluding. And in that sense, it is not socialist in the sense of a more inclusive model that, for example, a festival would be. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that, there are a number of artist participants in the Biennale who also have an activist practice, and sometimes those are one and the same. Carolina Caicedo is a great example. Sian Dayrit, artist from the Philippines, who was arrested last week in a protest against the building of large dams, and so I think possibly like the nature of the theme and the sort of many interrelated themes meant that there were practices which had a kind of call to action, if you want, at their heart. I'm not sure that we sort of set out to create sort of a call to action Biennale. And I guess, like, for me personally, I think, I lean towards, I guess, more non-prescriptive or non-didactic art, because I feel like that, is the power of art, that it can kind of, bring people in a different way, and it's not hitting you overhead necessarily with a political message, but it can sort of subtly work on, changing minds and opinions and hearts. But having said that, there were works, Torres Strait 8. We were very clear that we wanted to, give them a platform in order to kind of raise awareness about a very concrete, issue. So not sure that I answered your question, but sort of, there were both those kind of practices involved and I guess more sort of poetic ones.
I think we probably have time for one more question before we hand it over to the audience. I'm interested in how, to get a little more philosophical about it, how, it's kind of a tough question, how we can collaborate while maintaining difference, and it can be a really complicated thing. I mean, I read this beautiful essay not so long ago by Maria Lind, who defines this idea of the multitude as a substitute for collaboration. I'm just going to quote her here, and she describes it as a set of singularities in which each social subject maintains its difference. And I've also been knee deep in boring French philosophy recently as well, and and I really hate bringing up Deleuze in an art school because it just feels really but his idea that identity is derived from difference, not similarity. So how can we, not just through curating, but perhaps socially as well, how can we navigate the politics of inclusivity and exclusivity by maintaining difference?
That's a big question. I mean, I guess my sort of background is in like sort of feminist and queer practice and theory. So I'm sort of, for me, that's like, I don't know, like first wave, second wave. Like, are you seeking, are you seeking equal standing with something that's already established, or are you seeking to, for acknowledgement of difference? But I think, I think it's ultimately about respect and value, and creating a platform where, different people and different stories and different agendas can be heard. And the art world is, notoriously, what's the word? Hierarchical and non-inclusive, and not a safe space for many people. So it's sort of, slowly helping to change that.
Yeah. In a more sort of practical way, we didn't want the Biennale to look like an art fair with a space for each one of the artists, each one isolated in their little white cube or black box. Because what an exhibition really brings is the interaction between the works and the space. That is what we call curating, at least in my opinion, in understanding the medium, curating as a medium, like painting would be, or video, or drawing. So what are the logics of that medium, and how can you work with those logics? So in this case, we wanted to reivindicate cacophony as productive interference, hence the absence of walls between the works, particularly at the cutaway. But and it wasn't easy, many of the artists complained, but we said that from the outset, we need you to be aware that we will not create an enclosure for your work. Some embraced it, like Claire Millich, and created her own enclosure that was, was porous. Some we had to actually change midway because, for example, Hannah Tuliki's video needed a little, more seclusive setting to be properly experienced. So we did allowed for that. At the cutaway, everything was completely open, and the way we dealt with that complicated space was with Cape Urban creating this sort of river of bamboo that, in a way, perceptually created a presence there that obliterated that huge space that would have been oppressing to the works, but also because we provided them with the floor plan of the exhibition as we envisioned it, and they swirled around the other participants' works, creating pockets of space here and there. But that meant that these works were isolated by distance, in this case, not divided by walls, but also there was a lot of sound bleed, light bleed, and even mold bleed, as we learned the hard way midway through the exhibition. But those were ways of dealing with this idea of difference and individuality, and just letting those, conversations, sometimes uneasy conversations and juxtapositions happen. And I think, well, that was our proposal, exhibition-wise.
And the feedback on that has been interesting, because I guess, there is that sort of what is it, like a historical appreciation or sort of understanding of like the museum or the gallery as a space of kind of contemplative, reception or reflection, and so yeah, that sort of buzzing cacophony was not it's not to everybody's taste. You know, like some people are like, there's too many works in there, or you know. So
particularly in the pier, I would say, no,
Mm.
pier 2-3. Some people complained that there were too many works, and I agree. But you know, that was we had to make some hard choices, and then we did. Yeah.
I often find that sometimes the criticism that gets brought to curating can be superficial sometimes as well. I think that the you know, marrying research methodology, collaboration with artists, expectations, and then also the delivery of a physical space, it's a really difficult confluence of strategies and tasks to deal with. And I'm getting increasingly exhausted by comments about you know, exhibitions being too full, maybe, you know, without any kind of qualifications, because I think, as we were talking about earlier, people have become very accustomed to this beautiful minimalist, spare aesthetic of the white cube, which of course is incredibly tired. And before we arrived to the talk tonight, Jose and I shared a little bit about possible alternatives to that. I found that the Biennale had this beautiful, humble quality, Pavera quality, for a lack of better word, about it. As you said, you didn't want too much infrastructure. There was a nice sense to me that works were plonked or arrived there incidentally, more than being so beautifully arranged. And I think the constant challenge for curating, at least in my experience, is making exhibitions rather than nice rooms. So I think that was a great success, actually, for you, and certainly challenging for people, but a good challenge.
We wanted to go down in history as the only Biennale that didn't build a wall. Of course, it wasn't possible, but the few ones that we did build were done in just plain scaffolding. We only clad the surface that would receive the art and let the rest as it was. And we tried to use sustainable materials, which was a good idea, I think, but we even had a challenge with the British Council to discover new materials, but they weren't at the stage of where they could be produced at the scale needed to replace traditional materials like plywood or drywall or bubble wrap and all those materials that are currently used in exhibition design or in exhibitions. So we didn't want just to show them just to showcase new materials just for the sake of it. We wanted for them to be used as part of the exhibition design. So we ended up using only a couple, and then there were a couple that were shown to a certain extent as projects in the Biennale. Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Jose or Liz? Talia, Liz is there. Jasmine.
I'm just thinking of my students in China. I'm hoping very much that they're tuning in, so I'll use the microphone. Well, thanks so much for arranging this evening. And I've actually got 5 questions, but I'll just start with one. I am thinking of my students, of course. I'd like to ask you more about this question of the possibility of collaborative situations blunting radicality. I'd like to move sideways from that to the response of some reviewers, but certainly not all, to the exhibition. And these are reviews which, James, I feel are very considered, where the reviewers really led up to what they were saying by really looking and opening themselves to the exhibitions. But there were some reviewers who felt that the absence of walls and the sensation of the bleeding of one work into the other and that kind of liminality which you achieved actually led not to a blunting of radicality, but less urgency around many of the experiences and issues that the artists were bringing to the show. So I agree with you that curating is about a conversation between works and all that that entails. But I wondered if you could speak about that particular critique which came up in a number of reviews.
Yeah, well, it cannot be applied across the board because it could certainly be the case at the two Biennale managed venues, the Cutaway and Pier 23, but certainly not at NAS, where there were like 5 discrete rooms, or the MCA, where a more museum-like configuration was in place. Um, I guess that within the large rooms at the MCA, there were works conversing with each other. But it was, I don't think, I don't agree that um, I do think that there are interesting conversations between the works. Otherwise, it would have been something like too isolated. Let's say just Kiki Smith's tapestries by themselves, and then the installation by Tabitha Rezer. I think it would have lost a lot. There were these sort of things that led into the others, and we really discussed them, so much. It looks maybe happenstance, but those conversations where maybe there are not many walls, but the relationship between the work were studied, a lot, discussed a lot, and until we settled for what you could finally experience. So despite the lack of walls, the groupings were very much studied by the team.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder if it's sort of, like having many competing voices so that they're sort of drowning out each other. Is that, I don't know if that particular review or if that is what they were sort of getting at. But maybe it's just sort of a question of taste and subjectivity. And if you want to experience, a single thing, but I guess, one after the other. But I think for us, it was, as Jose said, sort of an intention that it was more than the sum of its parts, and that the the issues that are so common, or the sort of the voices or the practices, or what the artists and participants were sort of wanting to communicate, there was so much that was speaking to one another that for us it was sort of stronger as a collective.
And I want to tell the story. When I was one of the curators at the Sao Paulo Biennale back in 2006, this is a huge building designed by Oscar Niemeyer, one of the Brazilian modernists, and it's a pavilion in the midst of a large park, and it has windows on both sides. And this is like, I don't know, half a kilometer long. It's super long, and three levels. So, and there are columns all the way down. So what their struggle for the exhibition designers is to come up with a configuration that will set apart this incarnation of the Biennale from the previous ones, which is very difficult to do. So the designer that we worked with had worked with another of the very important Brazilian modernist designer, architects, Paulo Mendes da Rocha. She had an exquisite taste, and she decided she would clean all the windows, the side windows that were often, closed from the inside to have some walls to install the art. And instead of having like these walls here, she would put walls in the other. So there was like a central corridor, and then these spaces divided by 2 walls. So conceptually, it was beautiful. It made sense. You could experience the park. Everything was there. But I, having been, I am an architect at the beginning, you know, my first degree, and an exhibition designer. When I finally went there, I was shocked because it looked like an art fair. It was booth after booth after booth, and all the artists were isolated, save for a small part where I insisted that we cut down walls, and then there was some relationship. And the irony of it all is that the title of the Biennale was "How to Live Together," and I didn't see it coming. You know, I was there. Everybody was isolated. How to live together? We're isolated from each other, it seems. So I made it a point that in the following biennales that I would do, I would try to get, you know, works living together, even if that meant this uneasy and difficult cohabitation. And that's what we did.
I think also like that, you know, the pier obviously has been a venue previously. Cutaway's new, but the approach to certainly the pier and the you know, a few art projects that have been shown at the Cutaway is to have kind of one monumental, you know, like Brooke Andrew or, you know, Paul McCartney or Cardiff Miller at the pier to sort of yeah, occupy those Calvinist spaces with like one spectacular work. But we very intentionally you know, didn't go with big, you know, big star names or like a spectacle aesthetic. So
I think I'll add something as an objective voice in this as well. I've seen exhibitions that do both, you know, Jasmine, and I think that the criticism that was brought to it was this, was it urgency was the word that you used? Oh yeah, of course.
No, no,
Yeah.
no, I'm not
Yes.
sort of defending, you know, but rather showing, you know, why we ended up in that space. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
But this sense of, just to use the word from the review, urgency, in the Shanghai Biennale that Cuauhtemoc Medina did in 2018, I think it was, he had a corridor of works all separated, each room, one work per room. Also, people who are in Sydney will have seen it, the Caldor 13 rooms or however many rooms there were in that iteration. For me, so those actually, for me, expressed a sense of lack of urgency. That was my experience anyway of these kind of, especially in Cuauhtemoc's Biennale, having those individual works in there. Just as Jose was alluding to, they tended to feel like, to me, national pavilions or art fair booths. And secondly, and it's a much more practical point about curating, there are different ways to create separation between works than building infrastructure. And one of them is just creating a contrast between media, or creating contrast or dialogues even between artists. And actually Talia's show at Art Space, was that this year? Time's so elastic, or last year? Last year, there was a beautiful letter by Louise Bourgeois dead center in the exhibition that had almost no walls, actually just kind of two small new ones that were actually built with paintings. Actually, the walls were made from someone else's paintings. And all of the work around me did nothing to distract from the gravitas of that moment. So I think that curators are very aware of space. They are space makers as well as researchers. And I think that there are many devices outside of room building that can be useful in the repertoire.
that working? Firstly, respect to Bijigal and Gadigal, and thank you for the presentation. I'm really interested in the relationship and the granular detail of how you selected and your meetings. Not because I'm being nosy, not because I want you to recreate blood on the floor of your process of refining who went into the program. But I'm curious if you could give us a little bit more granular detail about that. And for context, just had a recent involvement in a curatorium for the Cementa Festival, which is a festival happens out 5 hours west of here. So we're always reviewing our processes. So curious to know about that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, this illustration here is one that we sort of used early on. So we came up with lots of different themes that we thought were relevant to the project. And then each one came up with many practices. So we did long weekly meetings where each one of us had to present as many practices as they wanted. And we discussed them, and some of us already knew them, so we would complement. Some were new for us in each case. And then we sort of created this pool of images that was becoming more and more unmanageable because, you know, there were by then, I don't know, hundreds of different artists and other practices. So we decided to do a curatorial retreat in a rural place for a week. And
Remember we said we can't use the word retreat. We had to say something
yeah,
else.
it had to be called curatorial something
Intensive or something.
Yeah. Because retreat sounded, you know, in my
Or no
broken
massages.
English. Yeah. And this is them, you know, 2 years they have been coping with my broken English. So sometimes I cannot get across what I really want to say.
Let's tease.
So we were there from dawn to dusk, trying to whittle down that list by voting on each other's, you know, we would have to, for example, we did several exercises. For example, out of all of the artists and other practices that you have brought to the table, choose only 5. What are the ones that you really care that much about? So that meant that you had to curate yourself because it's easy to throw out names there. But then if you have to really select only 5, which ones would those be? Then we also decided that we could vote on anything but the ones that we had proposed ourselves at a point, remember?
Yeah, we had to choose 5 or whatever the number it was from participants that other people had proposed and not ones that we had brought to the table.
Yeah, to otherwise somebody will root for something so much so that people will let it pass because they are just tired, you know, of arguing against. So there were many different strategies to try to come up with something that we all felt strongly about. So that was the core. Out of that meeting, we had around 60 different participants, I believe. And then we added 20 more in these were announced in April, I believe. And then we continued working. But I must say that COVID got in the way. We should have done longer meetings earlier, but we couldn't. So there was this situation that I moved here to be in Australia. And then, so I moved in November 2020, was out of quarantine in December. And then everything was supposed to, you know, be eased. And then we had another lockdown. So we ended up working, at least it was the same time zone, but working like we have been doing when I was still in Colombia, you know, over Zoom, each one at their own place, and never meeting in person for a long period. Yeah. So it was in a way not a fluid system. We would have done these meetings in person. You get a lot done when you are in the same room with other people. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose one thing that I think is critical is that we had a seed. You brought a seed idea to the table, which was why you were selected. I don't know how we would have started if it was like all the ideas in the world sort of thing, at least as sort of there was a framework to begin with, which then we could shape and mold. And
yeah, it was an idea that enabled us to reshape it collectively. And even though the name rivus suggests the river, actually is not the root for river. That would be ripa. Rivus is for a brook or stream or irrigation channel, but it sounds like river. Anyways, it is not about that. It is not about rivers. It is not about water. It's about much more, that delta of other things that came about in the course of our discussion. So it truly reflects a collective mind rather than a project that is fleshed out by other curators based on my idea. It is not. And Rivus was only adopted as a title in April during that long retreat or boot camp. At a point, it was going to be called River Mouth. Remember?
We had some weird names.
Oh yeah, we had many.
Title's probably the hardest,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. Yeah, because it frames the way people will read it, and we didn't want people to say, "Oh, this is the River Biennale or the Water Biennale," because it's too reductive, and it's not about that. It's more, if anything, about the voice of the non-human and how to decenter the human from the equation, and how to provide the possibility for more than human or non-human voices to be represented.
But I also, the having said that it's not about rivers and not about waterways, they did guide us in a lot of our thinking. So looking at, significant rivers, significant bodies of water, and artists that were working with them and their ecologies. So, that was a way of also looking at practice. And then we did a lot of, studio visits, online studio visits collectively.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
This is also, I mean, I guess it's not rocket science, but we made a point that once they were selected, we would meet as a group, the 5 of us, with each one of the participants to greet them and to explain the project and then some of us would remain, usually 2 of us, sometimes 3, with those artists throughout the entire development of the project. So each artist got to meet us all 1 or several times, and then 1 or 2 of us would be in charge of that particular artist or participant, with the assistant curators, 1 in each case, and sometimes the producers later on when we were talking about actually producing the work. So we all were aware of what the practice of that particular artist was, not only the one that had proposed, and they felt that because we made it a point. I don't know how many meetings we had, but there were really hundreds, and it paid off because we all felt really strongly about all of the participants that we selected.
Yeah, and I guess the intention was that we weren't, we weren't connected only to and curating only at our specific venues, that we sort of all worked across spaces. But I think, there's a lot of logistics, and as you would know with Samantha, like everybody has their day job. We were all sort of doing our full-time work, and then somehow doing this as well. So
And we didn't speak about one important component of the Biennale, which is the book. So we decided not to do a catalog. Nowadays, I mean, first of all, often works are not ready by the time a catalog goes to print. So the catalog very rarely reflects what was actually shown at the Biennale. Second, there are so many time-based works that a printed catalog cannot truly represent. So it's better if it's on the website. So that's what we did. The website became the catalog with the curatorial essays and the images of the actual works and links to videos and sound and all that, which led us or gave us the incredible freedom to create something entirely different. And we did the Glossary of Water, which is this book that some of you might have seen. Which takes the idea of a glossary as a structure that seems binding, A, B, C, D, Z. But then the words that are there, the concepts, the entries are completely arbitrary. And that enabled us to do an experimental exercise in freedom. This was done, co-edited with Juan Salazar, who is a professor at Western Sydney, with the participation of the Curatorium and the participants. But we told them that we would like them to submit an image and a piece of writing that couldn't be about their work. But you know, old habits die hard, and many sent in so-and-so's work unpacks the ta-ta-ta, you know, the curatorial jargon that, so we didn't use those texts. Those are in the website. Here it was like, point us to this piece of poetry from the 16th century that really talks about what the issues that you are preoccupied with. That would include, and we negotiated the rights to reprint. And we had each an essay on one of the entries. So unlike the typical catalog where the curator has the main essay and then there are images of the works, our entries are just one more entry, and mine is under the R, for example. It's not at the beginning, it's not the curatorial presentation or anything. So that was also a way to further develop our ideas behind the curating. So they are here in the book.
Thank you for your questions. I apologize if anybody has more questions, but we've run out of time. We've gone a little bit over tonight, so thanks for your patience. Can you please join me in thanking Talia and Jose for joining us tonight? I'd like to say, you know, go and enjoy the Biennale, but it ended on Monday. So instead of that, maybe just come up, introduce yourself, congratulate Talia and Jose on what a fantastic job they did. Thanks for coming.
thank you.